take a moment and consider how you might define terrorism. What are some behaviors that it might include? What about some behaviors it doesn't include? This is a critical question because how we define terrorism determines policy, it determines behavior both at an individual and societal level, and it shapes international opinion. It's a part of our decision when and how to use military force, and it's involved in our criminal justice system. So it's critical that we understand exactly what we mean. But keep in mind, terrorism isn't a physical entity with concrete dimensions that we can clearly identify. It tends to be fluid and shifts over time and place. In many ways, it's easiest to understand terrorism as a social construct. And what this means is that the way we're situated determines how we view reality. My dad used to always say people's perceptions are their reality. And that's what it comes down to, right? How we understand terrorism has a lot to do with how we're situated. If we're the people upon which the acts of terror are being imposed or inflicted, certainly we're more likely to view it as terrorism. Whereas if we are aligned with those carrying out those acts, we might view them as fighting for our freedom. It's important to remember that this term is often controversial and carries a lot of negative connotations. And in this way, it tends to be quite pejorative. And because there are so many definitions, there's no single accepted understanding. And so it's really critical that we understand why it's so difficult to define. Well, it includes so many different behaviors, right? It's not simply putting, something like anthrax in envelopes, or, the running an airplane into a building. It includes a whole slew of behaviors in between. And it's constantly evolving, and it's shifted by the local, national, and international political climate. And as I've noted, right, our perception shapes our reality. One person's terrorist is another's freedom fighter. And so depending on who you are and how you're looking at the problem, we might see behaviors very differently. So it's important to think about terrorism as having shifted in three notable ways. First, in terms of its purpose. Well, once they tend to be nationalistic groups that were fighting for political sovereignty from some dominant group, now typically it involves many diverse groups whose purpose is more to send a message, right? They're seeking to convey something to a larger audience. And to do so, they act through very different targets. Before, they typically would aim their behaviors at military and political leaders. And now the most common victims of terrorists are innocent civilians. And this also is reflected in their culture, their centralization. So their structure. Right now, these groups tend to be much more spread out, and there's no one leader upon which the whole group is structured. Things like social media and the internet have allowed people to connect across vast spaces and spread their message and their purpose much more broadly. However, all definitions do tend to recognize that terrorism is an act of violence, and that this violence is instrumental in achieving some sort of goal or purpose. And again, as noted in the previous slide, right, that the victims are typically defenseless. They're typically civilians or people that were not, can't do much to protect themselves. So the Department of Justice recognizes terrorism as the unlawful use of force and violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of a political or social objective. And if you're satisfied with that definition, then you can use this for your assignment. But I urge you to look around. Here's the UN General Assembly, and there are a number of other definitions. And with that in mind, think about what types of behaviors and actions might this include.